Hello and welcome to Indianomics. Bank shares have been at the vanguard of the recent fall across global markets and Indian markets as well. While bank shares globally have fallen on fears that the steep decline in commodities will lead to defaults by commodity companies, in India there is an additional worry. The Reserve Bank has recently made it clear that it wants bank balance sheets cleaned up by March 2017. The worry for the markets is what is the extent of unrecognized bad loans that need cleaning up. Till September, banks had recognized 5.1% of their loans as bad. They have, since the Raymond crisis, also restructured about 6.5% of their loans, and many fear that about 30 to 40% of these restructured loans could also default. Thirdly, banks have also been using a scheme called 525, which allows them to refinance, say, an 8 or 10-year loan as a 25-year loan with a reset clause at the end of 5 years. Besides, banks can force an SDR or a strategic debt restructuring of accounts that are about to slip. This SDR lets them convert their loans into equity, acquire 51% stake in the borrowing company, and sell it off to new promoters. Markets fear that in the process of using these tools, banks are not recognizing some obviously weak companies as NPAs or bad loans. Brokerages like Credit Suisse have calculated that companies whose EBITDA have been below their interest dues for 4 to 12 quarters are still standard in bank books. Brokerages like Credit Suisse and Macquarie say between 16 to 20% of loans have to be recognized as NPAs. A whisper number in the street is that the Reserve Bank wants 1.5 lakh crore of assets recognized as bad loans this year itself. If 20% of this has to be provided for, this could mean a bill of 30,000 crores. Next year, if a further 3 lakh crore has to be recognized, it means a further provisioning of 70,000 crores. Can PSU banks bear this burden? What will be the impact on their P&L, especially on 16 banks with stress advances over 16%? To answer this question on the impact on public sector banks, how many may report losses, I have two biggies from the rating agencies, Pawan Agarwal of CRISIL and Ananda of India Ratings. I also have with me someone who actually knows the numbers much better, Mr. C.V.R. Rajendran, former Chairman Managing Director of Andhra Bank, just recently retired. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Let me first ask each of your estimates. Pawan, what's your sense of the amount of stressed assets that banks have as of March 2016 and how much therefore they will have to provide?
Our estimate is that a right way to look at it, instead of adding all GNPAs and stressed assets, etc., a right way to look at it is a weak assets figure, which is where we add about 3-4 aspects. One is the gross NPAs is a starting point. Then we add about 35% of the gross restructured book, which is the restructured standard accounts. The third thing that we do is that we add about 75% of the security receipts that the bank has sold or issued when they have sold their assets to ARCs. And we have also started to add about 15% of the amounts that the bank are structuring under 525. The element that we need to now start recognizing is also the SDRs. It's a reasonably initial stage, and I think the success of the SDRs becomes critical. But apart from that, weak assets number will go up. That number in our estimate stands at about 7% of the overall banking system today, of which, and that cumulatively adds up to, from a systemic perspective, about 4.5-5 lakh crore. Of which, if you look at the provisioning, the cumulative provisioning today stands at about 1.5 lakh crore. And therefore, the remaining about 3 to 3.5 lakh crore kind of amount needs to be provided for over the next few years. I think that's really the context in terms of the provisioning which we are looking at.
So immediately, if you have to reach 25% of provisioning by March 2017, what you are speaking of is an additional 80,000 crore of provisions over this second half and next year?
See, how you pace out the provisioning is something that will depend upon the ability of of the banks to absorb that. If you look at overall, because most of this is likely to be coming with public sector banks, our estimates is that their pre-provisioning profits annually stand at about 1 lakh crore every year. And therefore, if they have to fully provide for the weak assets as we estimate of about 4.5 lakh crore, which means provide another 3 lakh crore, it's likely to take about 2.5-3 years organically, unless there are aspects that are added in terms of capital upfront that comes from government, or because we are expecting to see growth in the economy in India being continuing to be reasonably better than the global economy, and the push that we are seeing from the banking system to sell assets. If the assets themselves get upgraded or their stress levels improve.
No, those of course are at the moment a bit distant, even in terms of speculation. Ananda, what are your numbers? How much of unprovided stress is there, and therefore in the next 6 quarters, what may be the provisioning bill?
The provisioning, of course, is partly driven by what the regulations are. But what we did in August was a bottoms-up approach. So we looked at company by company where the stresses are, and we had certain filters based upon interest cover, debt to EBIT, market cap to debt, other measures, and we identified 30 companies, 30 groups actually, which were the most stressed in our view, and in various stages of recognition. Some of them were SMA 1 and SMA 2, some of them were not in these categories, were treated as standard, and we tried to figure out, because the arguments we were hearing at that point in time is that once the cycle turns, these projects are viable and would bounce back, and therefore doesn't require adequate provisioning. What we did was we've tried to figure out what would happen to their top line in a peak economic scenario, and then let's assume in 2018 or whenever the economy bounces back, what would be their debt service capabilities. And we realized unfortunately these companies have had a bit too much debt for even their peak servicing ability, and we realized that they would probably need to shave off their debt by anywhere between 20 to 30%. And most of these companies were in the sectors that were already been identified. Iron and steel, infrastructure were obviously the leading ones, and a few in textiles. But that number, the extent of under provisioning that the banking system apparently doesn't recognize at this point, but could be required over the next several years, came to about 1 lakh crores. If RBI now fast tracks that process, and I think that's a right approach, because once the banks make provision, they are in a better position to dispose these assets or negotiate better or seek revival of these assets. I think then an amount of about 1 lakh crore would need to be provided by the banking system over the next 6 quarters.
Okay, and this will mean that at least the bottom I think 16 banks that the RBI said have over 16% in terms of stress. So probably 14 of them at least are public sector banks. You would see these reporting losses if not given capital?
So we would think that most of the profits that the banks would generate over the next year or so, and keep in mind that we are still in a low interest rate regime, and so therefore NII is under pressure. We would think that most of the profits that these banks would generate would be required to make these provisions wherever there's a dip in capital. So growth capital would be need to be supported by the government. And therefore, if the assumption earlier of the 70,000 crores that the government had budgeted, the assumption there was, of course, improving profitability. Since we are actually looking at a reversal, our sense is that requirement, that budgeting by the government would probably need to be stepped up significantly, probably doubled.
Mr. Rajendran, what is your estimate? You see it from closer quarters. These gentlemen are speaking about 3 to 3.5 lakh crore of further stress that has to be recognized. What's your estimate?
Could be a possibility. 3 to 3.5 lakh crores could be a possibility. And banking system has the ability to provide for it, as CRISIL report says. Maybe in another 2 years, the entire amount can be absorbed. And already 60% provision coverage is there in some banks. At least on an average, about 50% provision coverage is there. The stress seems to be, the problem seems to be in 3 accounts. As far as the 150 accounts are concerned, when I talk to many banks, most of the banks say they already recognize this as an NPA and the provisions are already made. There is nothing new. This case of divergence was found out by the AFI reports all through the years, and this was done in the first quarter itself for all the banks together, a coordinated approach. So there is nothing new. These 150 accounts may not create a tremendous pressure. I understand those banks which are not provided for it will be in a position to absorb it in the next 2 quarters. That is a December quarter and March quarter, it will be completely provided for. The concern seems to be about the restructured accounts. The McCarr report says that 41% of the restructured accounts which are coming for the repayment now after completing the moratorium are failing. I don't have the number. I don't know whether the number is right. Presuming that it is right, which means about 20% of the accounts, restructured accounts, ought to be provided for. That is a mind-boggling number for us. If that number is true, probably the provision coverage should start right from now. I think RBI has already sounded the people to start providing for the restructured accounts more than the 5% which we already have. Already 5% provision is made as per the RBI rules. The next 6 quarters, probably if they start providing another 2.5 to 3%, then they will build 14 to 18% provision, because most of the accounts are restructured during the last 2 years. So when the moratorium is completed, 14% provision will be there even if the account fails.
Mr. Rajendran, these are a lot of numbers. I want to know that in terms of lakh crore. So we will give ourselves a break. More detailed analysis in a minute. Welcome back to Indianomics. We have been hearing a lot of pressure from the Reserve Bank on banks to recognize this far unrecognized NPLs as NPLs and provide for them. What exactly are the broad numbers that banks have to take out from their profit and keep as provisions is the topic of discussion. We just had Pawan Agarwal of CRISIL and Ananda bhoumik of India Ratings tell us that about 3 lakh crore is the unrecognized stress. Mr. Rajendran, you said that you broadly agree with the CRISIL numbers, and separately we have this 150 accounts which Reserve Bank has recognized. Let us talk pure numbers. This year, for the second half, for which numbers are not reported, how much more provisioning you think will be needed to provide for these 150 accounts?
Now, 150 accounts, I don't know what is the volume. Market is talking about somewhere between 1 lakh and 1,50,000 crores. Some of the banks are already provided for it. So not every bank needs to provide for it. Presuming that 50,000 crores is already provided, 1 lakh crore is to be provided, 15% provision requires 15,000 crores. And if it is spread over a period of 2 quarters, 7,500 crores per quarter is not a very alarming number for me. As far as the restructured accounts are concerned, McCarr report says 41% of the restructured accounts which are coming for repayment today after completion of the moratorium is not able to meet the payments and becoming NPAs at that point of time. Presuming about 6 lakh crores is the NPA, I don't have the exact number, it's roughly about that number. 6 lakh crores, about of which 3 lakh crores is already completed the moratorium period coming out for the repayment today, out of which 41% is failing. If it is failing, about 1,20,000 crores is failing. It requires about 15% provision as of now. Even if you talk about 25% provision which RBI is talking about, 5% provision is already made for these restructured accounts and 20,000 provision is to be added to it. 1,20,000 crores, 20% means about 24,000 crores is extra amount which we may have to provide.
24,000 crores in the next 1 year.
Next 1 year period, right.
Do you believe that just this 11.8%, that is GNPA plus restructured, I think 11.3 which is recognized, is all the stress? There is stress outside that. So what is your guess of the total assets known so far? I mean, several more may become bad, but as of now, should we go with 11.8? Is that a fair number? Or should we think it is 13, 14, 15?
No, 11.8 may not be a fair number from my opinion, because there are some assets which will, which are having the stress inbuilt as because of this record of recovery or because of some evergreen efforts or for sanction of new facilities. It might have been concealed in some banks, but this will come out. Now, RBI is very clear about it. RBI doesn't permit, unless the cash flow is from the operations, RBI is not willing to accept it as a repayment at all. So these accounts will be shown as NPA. That is the effort in these 150 accounts. So some more NPAs may be declared in some banks, not in all banks. Outside that, what is the restructured accounts which are failing? That number is little higher when McCarr report says out 41% is failing when it is coming for, that is a very very large number.
So
out of the restructured accounts with 40% is failing.
What is your number?
No, my experience has been every quarter I was seeing about 5% is getting into the NPA in the past. So about 20% of the restructured accounts were getting into the NPA portfolio from restructured to NPA in the past. Maybe it may go up slightly more, 25%, 30%. Okay.
All right. Well, Ananda, final question to you. How many banks do you think may report losses? The pace at which provisioning is demanded from the regulator?
I think if you look at the vulnerability obviously is there with the PSU banks, unfortunately, and our sense is that banks with a pre-provision operating profit percentage of less than 0.5%, in essence where the ROAs are at 0.3 or 0.4, are obviously the ones most vulnerable, which I think would mean about 50 to 60% of the PSU banking space at this point, and likely based upon their likely NII performance in FY17 is possibly under pressure of using up bulk of their profits for the additional provisioning.
Okay. Well, Pawan, the India ratings number that the bottom half of the banks could be vulnerable, is that a fair picture? That will mean almost about 10 public sector banks.
If I look at our ratings, Lata, our ratings in public sector banks, about 9 or 10 of them have negative outlook, and then that's something that will give you a good picture of the likely movement in the credit profile over the next 12 to 18 months, and that really is about half of the public sector banks today.
Fair enough. Would you agree with that number? Those are the banks where we may see losses and where the government will have to take some serious steps in terms of either recapitalizing or consolidation or some such steps.
No, the loss reported is for a single quarter or 2 quarters. We need not think much into it. If it is continuous, then we have to worry about it. There are banks which have reported losses. Central Bank has reported loss, Bank of India has reported loss. That is a cleaning up process. As a one-time measure, when these 150 accounts are to be accommodated, some banks are going to incur losses. That is okay. But they will be in a position to come back. As Anand rightly puts in, the liability side also a lot of responsibility is coming from the banks now. Now, all the bulk deposits are paid back. CASA ratios are increasing. The cost of deposit is coming down. The NIM could expand in the future. So, I think that maybe the ability to absorb losses may go up with the banks also.
Well, I just want to have last one question to all of you. Mr. Rajendran, the Reserve Bank and the government have been pressuring, telling the banks that there won't be any political pressure. Do you think that you already have a Sahara and a Vijay Mallya who have been declared as defaulters and various degrees of penalties have been imposed on them? Do you see 1 or 2 more business groups genuinely being taken on and made to pay?
That's happening today. I have not seen, heard in the market that government has pressurized any bank on either the sanctions or on the recovery.
And nobody has lost their assets, control of their assets. We know some of the big defaulters, groups like SR. Do you think that the government, the banks will go after them?
No, nobody has come in the way of banking taking action as on date. To what extent banks will be in a position to put together and act together is a different thing. There are a lot of legal hurdles which are coming in. But even the legal processes of Finance Ministry is talking about simplifying now, and the DRT courts being fastened up. There are no arguments at all, only written arguments he is talking about.
Yes.
The process will be hastened and probably will be in a position to realize at the earliest.
I'm a little doubtful about the legal processes getting hastened at all. Well, that's the final question to you, Pawan. Outside the realm of rating, do you think that it will be necessary for the government to move against one more group, or at least allow the banks to change the ownership of one of the most delinquent groups? Will that be an example which will automatically bring back money from some of the indebted promoters?
I think that process has already begun. If you look at the SDRs, SDR is a institutional response to a requirement like this.
And small pickings. We have not seen big guns like SR who have defaulted twice on their steel payments, twice restructured steel accounts. FRNs, they defaulted to their foreign lenders. Their OFCDs, they defaulted to their domestic in SR oil. Do you see the government taking on some big group like that?
Yeah, again, I think the response has to be more institutional, which is, as I said, the process has begun. I think my understanding is that the SDR process is gaining momentum. The success of SDR actually will move ahead some of this process, and also the banks today are far more focused upon asset sales, and we have seen a lot of asset sales happening from some of the very large indebted groups as well. So therefore the process has begun. It will take time given the legal complexities and the structure that we have in India, but we are on the right path.
Well, Mr. Rajendran, Pawan Agarwal and Ananda Bhoumik, thank you very much for joining me in this conversation. Well, key takeaways. One, the market's estimate, as you heard from the rating agencies, is that the total amount of bad assets is probably around 5 lakh crore that has not been provided. Bankers tell us that the whisper number doing the rounds for the current year is that at least 1.5 lakh crore needs to be provided for. But RBI officials tell us that for the next year, it is impossible to find out how much will need provisioning because it's a dynamic situation, will depend on steel prices and the India growth story itself. But fourthly, and that's an important takeaway, RBI officials told us that government and RBI are on the same page when it comes to cleaning up bank balance sheets. Fifth, government has assured banks that they are ready to provide whatever capital that is needed after the cleanup process is over. Also, RBI officials say that they are ready to provide any liquidity support if needed in the process of high provisioning should the banks need. As well, RBI stands ready to provide any regulatory relief that they believe is available, that is provided banks need that kind of capital support. But the message is that all parties want banks' balance sheets to be cleared. And the final takeaway, it would be very good if banks, government and RBI show the same commitment to go after at least 1 or 2 delinquent promoters and actually divest, seize their assets and bring in new promoters. That will perhaps make other defaulting promoters fall in line. All told, it appears that the entire exercise will make banks safer and cleaner in terms of their balance sheets, more reliable entities. As well, India perhaps will be seen as a place where crooks and defaulters are punished. Looks like the exercise is all for the best. That's it on Indianomics. Thanks for watching.